If you've ever been told you weren't worth anything, this story is for you. Stay with us until the end because what happens in that mountain valley will break your heart open and put it back together again. And if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story like this one. He paid his life savings to buy her freedom, then said you can leave whenever you want. The dust on Main Street of Laramie Falls blew in hard that August morning, the kind that found every crack and crease that coated a person's teeth and settled behind their eyes. Nora Calloway stood with her back pressed against the rough-hewn post outside her father's general store, and she did not allow herself to cry. She had promised herself that much. Gerald Calloway's voice carried across the street the way bad news always carried loud and without shame. He stood on the front steps in his good coat, the one he kept for church and for occasions that required the appearance of respectability, and he was talking to Harlan Pike like a man conducting ordinary business on an ordinary morning. She's able-bodied, Gerald said, 24 years old, good with figures, good with her hands, keeps a clean house, cooks better than any woman I know. Harlan Pike stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt, squinting at Nora the way a man squints at livestock he is not quite sure about. Pike was thick through the middle with a jaw like a barn door and eyes that had the color and warmth of dirty creek water. He ran the largest gambling house between Cheyenne and the Montana line, and he had the look of a man who had spent 40 years taking things that did not belong to him. "How much?" Pike said. The words landed on Nora like a hand across the face. She had known this was coming. She had known it the way you know a bad winter is coming, the way you feel it in the air a full month before the first snow falls. Her father had been borrowing from Pike for 3 years, small amounts at first, then larger ones, and lately she had heard them arguing in the back room of the store after closing time. Pike's voice low and unhurried, her father's voice climbing toward panic. She had known, and still the actual sound of it, the casual way Pike said how much as though she were a horse or a parcel of land, stripped something out of her that she could not name. People on the street had stopped moving. 2 cowboys leaned against the hitching rail outside the feed store, watching with the blank interest of men who had nowhere pressing to be. A woman in a blue dress pulled her daughter close and turned away. From the doorway of the Grand Laramie Hotel, 3 railroad men stood with their coffee cups going cold in their hands. Nobody said a word. Nobody moved to leave either. Nora kept her eyes forward and her spine straight. She would not give them the satisfaction of watching her collapse. $30, Gerald said. That's a fair price. Pike tilted his head. 20, and I'm being generous. She can keep books. She kept mine for 4 years without a single error. 22, Pike said as though he were haggling over grain. Final offer, a woman her age unmarried. It's not exactly a seller's market, Gerald. Laughter from somewhere in the small crowd. Nora felt her jaw tighten until her back teeth ached. 22 years she had kept this man's books cooked. His meals raised her brother Thomas after their mother died of fever when Thomas was 9 years old, and this was the number they had settled on. $22, $1 for each year. She thought about running. She thought about it with a clear, cold clarity, calculated the distance between herself and the nearest alley, estimated how far she would get before Pike sent someone after her. She was fast, but she did not know this territory the way she knew Bitter Creek where she'd grown up. Laramie Falls was new. They had moved here only 2 years ago, and the prairie beyond the town's edge was not her prairie. She would be caught within the hour or she would be lost on the plain within the day. Either way, she would be worse off than she was now. So she stood. She kept her back straight and her chin level, and she did not look at her father's face because she knew that if she looked at it, she would see something that would finish breaking the last thing inside her that was still intact. Pike started toward her. He moved the way large men move when they have never been stopped, slow and certain, as though the space in front of them is theirs by right. Nora pressed back against the post, her hands flat against the wood, her heart a hard, rapid knocking in her chest. "Let me have a look at you," Pike said. He reached up one hand toward her face. "You'll step back." The voice came from the edge of the gathered crowd, and it had the quality of a sound that belongs to open spaces, low and unhurried, and carrying a weight that had nothing to do with volume. Every head on the street turned. The man standing at the edge of the crowd was lean and weathered, somewhere in his middle 30s, with dark hair that wanted cutting and 3 days of beard on a jaw that had seen weather. He was dressed in trail clothes, worn canvas and leather that had spent serious time outdoors, and he carried himself with the stillness of a man who had spent years in places where sudden movement was a form of error. Beside him stood a mule loaded with canvas-wrapped bundles. His eyes were gray, Not the soft gray of overcast sky, but the hard pale gray of river ice in February. He was looking at Pike with the particular quality of attention that suggested he had already considered every possible outcome of this moment and had settled on one. "This is private business, stranger," Gerald Calloway said with the shaky authority of a man who knows he is in the wrong but has committed too far to stop. The man did not look at Gerald. He was still watching Pike. "I'm Cole Maddox," he said, "and there's no such thing as private business conducted in the middle of a public street." He paused. "Step back from her." Pike's face did something complicated. There was a moment, a brief and interesting moment, where he seemed to genuinely consider his options. Pike was a large man and a dangerous one, and he had the advantage of being on familiar ground. But Cole Maddox was standing with a quality of absolute stillness that most men learn only one way, and Pike had been around long enough to recognize it. He stepped back, one step, then two. "You buying," Pike said. His voice had changed, quality dropped the lazy contempt. "Because if you're buying, that's a different conversation." Cole walked to his mule without hurrying. He untied one of the canvas bundles and set it on the ground, then knelt and opened it. What spilled out onto the dust of Main Street was a run of pelts, dark and heavy beaver and fox, the kind of furs that took months in serious mountain country to collect. The crowd made a sound. Even Nora, standing with her back against the post and her arms crossed over her chest, understood what she was looking at. Those pelts represented the better part of a year's solitary work in the high country. She had grown up around trappers and traders, and she knew the going rate. "That's $60 worth of fur," Cole said, straightening. He looked at Gerald Calloway directly for the first time. "$60 says her debt is cleared, her indenture is settled, and she walks out of here a free woman." Gerald's mouth opened and closed. "I had a deal with Pike," he said. "Pike hadn't paid yet," Cole said. "Until money changed hands, there's no deal." He looked at Pike. "You agree with that?" Pike looked at the pelts. He looked at Cole. He looked at the pelts again. $60 was a significant sum, considerably more than 22. And whatever else Harlan Pike was, he was first and always a man who understood numbers. "I'll take the furs," Pike said. He looked at Gerald. "Debt's cleared. We're square." Gerald Calloway looked at the furs, and then at his daughter, and then at Cole Maddox, with an expression that contained in roughly equal measure relief, shame, and the particular resentment of a man who has been made to feel small in public. He did not look at Nora again. He went back into the store. The door closed behind him. Nora stood still for a long moment, listening to the sound of her own breathing, the dust moving on the street, the shuffle of the crowd beginning to disperse. Some looked curious, some looked guilty. A few were already deciding that they hadn't really seen what they had seen. Cole Maddox walked toward her. He stopped several feet away, which she noticed the deliberate maintenance of distance, and he looked at her with those pale gray eyes that gave nothing away easily. "I'm riding north," he said. "I've got a base camp in the Ridgeback foothills about 2 days out. You can come with me if you want, or I'll put you on the westbound stage to Cheyenne this afternoon. Your choice. Either way, you walk out of this street as your own woman." Nora stared at him. "Why?" she said. The word came out smaller than she intended. Cole was quiet for a moment. "Because what just happened here is wrong," he said, "and I was in a position to stop it. That's reason enough." "Those furs," Nora said, "that's months of work." "Furs can be replaced." She looked at him for a long moment, the stranger with the ice-colored eyes and the unhurried way of speaking. And she thought about Cheyenne. She thought about what waited for her in Cheyenne, a city where she knew no one, with no money, no references, no plan. She thought about Thomas, her brother, 16 years old, and gone 2 weeks now following a man named Decker Holt, who had come through Laramie Falls with promises of easy wages on a cattle drive that Nora had known. With the sick certainty of a woman who has learned to read trouble was not a cattle drive. She needed to find Thomas before Decker used him up and threw him away. She needed help she could not afford to refuse. "I'll go with you," she said. "North." Cole nodded a single motion and turned back toward his mule. As Nora fell into step beside him, she felt the weight of the street's eyes on her back, and she did not turn around to give them the satisfaction of one last look. Bitter Creek had taught her, you walk away from a thing without looking back, or you spend the rest of your life half-turned. She looked straight ahead at the mountains. And they stopped at Granger's Mercantile on the north end of town, where Cole laid down coin for a pair of decent boots, a wool coat, a bedroll, and 3 days of provisions without comment or ceremony, as though outfitting a woman for mountain travel was a transaction he performed regularly. Nora accepted each item with a nod, and no more because The alternative to accepting was pride. And she had spent 24 years discovering that pride was a currency she could not afford to spend on small purchases. Outside the mercantile, a boy of about 10 was sitting on a barrel, watching them with undisguised interest. "Mister," the boy said to Cole, "is that lady your wife?" "No," Cole said. "Is she your prisoner?" Cole glanced at Nora. Something moved briefly through his eyes that might have been amusement. "No," he said. "Then what is she?" Cole secured the last pack on his mule's back and checked the knot twice before answering. "She's a free person," he said, "same as anybody." The boy appeared to find this unsatisfying but said nothing more. They left Laramie Falls on the North Road at 9:30 in the morning. The August heat was already building a flat, pressing weight that turned the prairie to shimmer at the edges. Cole walked ahead, leading the mule, setting a pace that was steady without being punishing. Nora walked beside and slightly behind, watching the way he moved, the way his eyes swept the terrain at regular intervals, the way his hand rested near but never on his sidearm, a habitual awareness rather than active tension. She had known men who wore their guns with swagger as decoration or as threat. Cole wore his the way he wore the rest of his gear, as a tool that served a function and deserved no further consideration until it was needed. After an hour of walking in silence, she said, "Why are you going to the ridgeback?" He didn't look back. "Working." "Trapping?" A pause. "Mostly." She filed that away and said nothing more. By midday, they had left the flat prairie behind, and the land had begun to tilt upward. Long grass giving way to sage and scrub pine, the mountains closer now, and more defined in their upper flanks, still carrying the blue shadow of distance. Cole called a halt in the shade of a sandstone outcrop, and they ate hardtack and jerked beef and drank water from his canteen without conversation. Nora watched the country and thought about Thomas. She had last seen him on a Tuesday 3 weeks ago. He had come to the store in the early morning before Gerald was up, and she had been sweeping the front steps, and he had stood in the road with his hat in his hands, looking like a bog, trying to appear older than he was, which was exactly what he was. "Decker Holt's outfit is heading to Miles City," he'd said. "He needs riders. It's $4 a week, Nora, $4. She had tried to explain what she knew about Decker Holt, the rumors she'd collected, the way she collected everything that might matter quietly and without calling attention to herself. Decker moved stock, but not always stock he owned. Decker employed young men who needed money because young men who needed money asked fewer questions. Decker had been run out of 2 counties, and the men who ran him out had not been law-abiding citizens, which told you something about the kind of person who found Decker Holt unacceptable. Thomas had listened with the patience of a boy who had already decided and was only waiting for her to finish. "I have to do something," he said. "I can't watch him sell you, Nora. I can't." She had told him their father wouldn't really do it. She had believed it when she said it. 3 weeks later, on a hot August morning, she had stood against a post on Main Street and listened to a man offer $22 for her life. She finished her water and stood and shouldered her bedroll, and did not say any of this to Cole Maddox because she did not know him and because the words were not ready yet. They walked until late afternoon, when the sky in the west began to go orange and the temperature dropped 10 degrees in the span of an hour with the speed that high country evenings have in late summer. Cole chose a campsite in a grove of cottonwoods beside a shallow creek, a good site sheltered on 2 sides with clean water and dry wood near to hand. He made camp with the efficiency of long-practiced canvas shelter strung between 2 trees, fire ring cleared, and built mule-tied and unsaddled and watered. Nora helped without being asked because standing still while someone else worked was not something she was built for. She gathered wood. She built the fire, which caught on her second attempt. Cole watched her hands as she arranged the tinder, but said nothing until the flame had established itself. "You've built fires before," he said. "My whole life," she said. "My father considered cooking below him." Cole nodded and set a skillet over the fire and began cutting salt pork into it without comment. Above them, the cottonwood leaves were turning gold at the edge in the early dark, and the creek made its small, patient sound over stones. The fire built itself up slowly, and the smell of the salt pork was the smell of 100 winter evenings, and Nora felt something in her chest ease by a fraction of a degree. Not safe. She had not felt safe in so long, she was no longer certain she would recognize the sensation. But quieter. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Cole turned the pork. "Go ahead." "Back there, in town." She considered how to shape the question. "You said you were working in the Ridgeback. What kind of work?" He was quiet for a moment. The fire spat. "Investigation," he said. "For who?" "For myself, mostly." He glanced at her across the fire. I used to work for the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. I left 3 years ago. Now I work independently. Nora turned this over. A Pinkerton former working alone in the Ridgeback foothills with a mule and a stack of beaver pelts. The pelts were real. She had handled one at the Mercantile when he wasn't watching the weight and quality of months of genuine outdoor work. But a former detective who had walked away from Pinkerton did not spend months in the mountains for furs alone. "What are you investigating?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment with those still gray eyes. "There was a fire," he said, "in a town called Copper Bluff 3 years back. Town treasury burned. 3 people died. The man responsible walked away." The fire popped. Nora kept her face still. "They never caught him," she said. "No, that's why you're in the Ridgeback. The trail leads here," Cole said, "or near enough." He did not say anything else, and Nora did not ask. But she sat with the weight of what he had said, and the fire between them, and the slow darkening of the sky overhead, and she thought about the way her father had come home from Copper Bluff in the spring of 1881 with more cash money than she had ever seen him carry, and the way he had been unable to explain it, and the way she had forced herself not to ask, because asking meant knowing and knowing meant deciding what to do with what she knew. She had been 21 years old and already so tired of deciding things. She looked into the fire and did not say any of this. Cole handed her a plate, and they ate in the easy silence of 2 people who were accustomed each in their own way to eating alone. After supper, when the fire had settled to coals and the creek was loud in the dark, Cole said, "The offer I made you this morning still stands. Tomorrow morning, if you want me to turn south and put you on the Cheyenne Road, I will." Nora pulled her coat closer. The temperature had dropped quickly the mountain way, and the stars above the cottonwoods were very bright. "I have a reason for going north," she said. "I figured," he said. She looked at him across the coals. "My brother, he's 16. He went with a man named Decker Holt 3 weeks ago. Holt's outfit operates out of the Ridgeback country." Cole was very still for a moment. Then he said carefully, "You know what kind of operation Decker Holt runs?" "I know enough," she said. "That's why I need to find Thomas before he knows enough too." The fire between them was low and red, and the silence stretched out, and in it, Nora was aware of the strangeness of this sitting across a dying fire from a man she had known for less than a day in a country she did not know, telling him the only thing that mattered. Cole leaned forward and added a small piece of wood to the coals, and the flame caught and rose again. "I know where Holt's outfit camps," he said finally. Nora's breath caught. She waited. "I've been watching it for 6 weeks," Cole said. As part of the investigation, he looked up at her. "Your brother, Thomas Calloway, 16 dark hair, came in from the south 3 weeks ago. You've seen him." "I've seen him." A pause. "He's all right. He's working the Remuda tending horses. Holt hasn't put him on anything serious yet." The relief was so sudden and physical that Nora had to set her plate down to keep from dropping it. She pressed her hands flat on her thighs and breathed slowly and evenly until the shaking stopped. "Yet," she said. "Yet," Cole confirmed. He was watching her with something that was not quite pity, which she was grateful for. Pity was a thing she found harder to bear than contempt. "Which means there's still time." Nora looked into the fire for a long moment. Then she looked up at Cole Maddox. "You're going after Holt's outfit," she said, "for the investigation." "Yes. And Holt is connected to the man from Copper Bluff." Cole said nothing, which was itself an answer. Nora sat with this. She sat with the shape of what she was beginning to understand, the geometry of it, the way the lines connected, and she felt a slow, cold certainty move through her that had nothing to do with the night air. "Cole," she said. He waited. "The man from Copper Bluff," she said. "Do you know his name?" Cole looked at her across the fire with those gray eyes that held everything and revealed nothing. "I have a strong suspicion," he said carefully. Nora nodded. She looked back into the fire and she said, "So do I." The coals settled and shifted. The creek ran over its stones. Above the cottonwoods, the stars burned cold and very far away. Neither of them said anything more that night. Cole pointed her to the shelter he had made, and Nora wrapped herself in the blankets he had provided and lay down on the pine needle floor with her eyes open for a long time, watching the shadows of the cottonwood branches move on the canvas above her, listening to Cole settle across the fire entrance. The sounds of a man making himself watchful rather than comfortable. She thought about her father. She had loved him once in the way children love imperfect things completely and without requiring them to deserve it. She had watched him over the years become harder and more afraid. Watched the fear in him turn to something meaner. Watched him borrow and lie and cut corners in ways that had cost other people more than they cost him. She had told herself stories about why the grief after her mother died, The pressure of keeping the store, the loneliness of a man who had never learned to ask for what he needed. But there was a difference between understanding why a person was the way they were and excusing what they did with it. A fire in 1881, 3 people dead, a man who walked away. She closed her eyes. Outside, something moved in the dark cottonwoods, a night animal small and unhurried. The fire was nearly out. Cole was quiet in the way of a man who was still awake. "Cole," she said softly. "Yes." "Thank you," she said, "for this morning." He didn't answer for a moment. "Then get some sleep, Nora. Long day tomorrow." It was not warmth exactly. It was not comfort. But it was steadiness, the same quality she had noticed in him from the first moment, a man who did not move or speak or act with wasted energy, who seemed to know exactly where he stood in the world and was not troubled by the knowledge. She had never met anyone like that before. She fell asleep listening to the sound of the creek. King. The second day of travel took them out of the foothills and into the first real lift of the mountains, the trail climbing steadily through stands of pine and aspen, the air thinning in a way Nora felt in her lungs, clean and cold, and smelling of resin and stone. Cole set a pace that was slower than the day before, accounting for the grade, and by mid-morning they had risen high enough that Laramie Falls was invisible behind them. The whole flat eastern plain spread like a table below. Nora stopped to look at it. She had a complicated relationship with big views. She had grown up in a place with a long horizon, and she understood the way space could be either freedom or exposure depending on where you were standing. Down there in that flat brown distance was the life she had just left the store, the post, the sound of her father's voice conducting ordinary business with a man who wanted to buy her. Up here, the air was too thin and too pure for all of that to seem entirely real. "It gets easier," Cole said from ahead of her, reading something into her stillness. "Does it?" The looking back part. He didn't turn around. "First few days, every time you look down, you're calculating the distance back. After a while, you stop looking down." Nora pulled her coat tighter and followed him up the trail. They stopped for water and rest at noon beside a spring that Cole knew, a cold, clear upwelling from the rock that tasted of minerals and snow. While the mule drank, Cole sat on a boulder and cleaned his rifle with the methodical attention he gave to everything, and Nora sat a little distance away and watched the eagles making long, slow circles above the higher peaks. "Tell me about Thomas," Cole said without looking up from his work. "What do you want to know? What he's like? How he thinks?" A pause. "If I'm going to help you get him out of Holt's outfit, I need to understand whether he'll come willingly." Nora thought about Thomas. Thomas at 9 years old, holding her hand at their mother's grave with an expression of bewildered grief that no 9-year-old should have to carry. Thomas at 12, teaching himself to read maps because he wanted to be an explorer, poring over old survey charts by lamplight, while Gerald Calloway slept in the next room. Thomas at 16, standing in the road with his hat in his hands, too proud to take money and too young to know what he was walking into. "He's stubborn," she said. "Proud the way boys are when they think being proud is the same as being strong. He's not reckless, not naturally, but he'll take risks for people he cares about." A pause. "He went with Holt partly because he thought he was helping me. If I could make him understand that the best help he could give me is to come home, he'd come." Cole nodded slowly, still working the rifle. "What about the other part?" he asked. "The other part? You said he went partly to help you." His gray eyes lifted. "What's the other part?" Nora looked at the eagles. "He wanted to be somewhere he mattered," she said finally. "Somewhere he was doing something. Our father never gave him much of that. You can only be invisible for so long before you start looking for somebody who'll see you." Cole was quiet for a moment. "I understand that," he said. The way he said it was not a courtesy. It was the sound of a person recognizing a truth they knew from the inside. She looked at him across the spring. He had gone back to cleaning the rifle, and his face was closed again, the brief opening shut. She did not push it. They reached the valley on the afternoon of the second day. Cole called it Ridgeback Valley, and Nora understood why when she saw it, a long folded crease in the mountain terrain, with a ridge running along its spine like the back of a great sleeping animal. The valley was hidden in the way certain mountain places are hidden, visible only from the trail that entered it, invisible from the east or the south. A person who didn't know it was there would ride past it on the lower trail without suspecting. The cabin sat against the valley's north wall, half sheltered by a limestone overhang and 3 large ponderosa pines. It was small and solid and had been built by someone who understood weather. Roof-lined deep-cut windows, a door hung on iron hinges that would swing true even when the wood swelled with winter moisture. A lean-to stable stood to the east, and beyond it a kitchen garden that had been tended the recent disturbance of soil around the bean rows, suggesting he had been here within the last 2 weeks. "This is your base camp," Nora said. "This is home," Cole said. He led the mule into the lean-to and began unsaddling. "Has been for 3 years." Nora stood in the valley entrance and looked at the cabin and the lean-to and the garden and the ridge above it all, and she felt something strange happen in her chest, something that was almost pain, but was not quite. It was the sensation of looking at a thing and having your body understand something your mind had not caught up to yet. It looked like a place where a person could live without being afraid. Inside the cabin was one large room with a sleeping loft, a stone fireplace that occupied most of the north wall, a plank table and 2 wooden chairs. A bookshelf held a dozen volumes, a survey map of the territory pinned above the fireplace, and a set of Pinkerton field manuals that had been used until their spines cracked. On the table was a leather-bound ledger and 3 stacks of papers weighted with stones. Nora looked at the papers without touching them. Cole came in behind her carrying supplies from the mule's packs. "Loft's yours," he said, setting the provisions on the table. "I'll take the floor by the fire." "I don't want to push you out of your own bed," she said. "It's my house," he said. "I can sleep where I want." He looked at her steadily. "You'll be safer up there. More private." She nodded. She climbed the ladder and found a narrow, clean space with a pallet and blankets and a single small window that looked out over the valley, over the ridge, and the sky beyond it, very wide and very blue. She sat on the pallet's edge and looked out the window for a long time. Below her, she could hear Cole moving around, the sound of fire being built, the clunk of the iron pot on the hook. Practical sounds, steady sounds. She pulled her knees up and wrapped her arms around them and let herself very carefully begin to hope. It had been such a long time since she had allowed that particular feeling that she had almost forgotten what it felt like. It felt, she decided, like standing at a high window looking at a lot of sky. Neh. That evening after they had eaten, Cole spread the survey map on the table and showed her where Holt's outfit was camped. 3 miles southeast, he said, tracing the route with one finger. Down into the lower valley and through the pine break. They've been in that location for 2 months. They move when they feel watched. Nora studied the map. "Do they feel watched?" "Not yet." He looked up at her. "I've been careful." She looked at the camp location, a small X marked in pencil in a valley crease below a ridge. 3 miles. Thomas was 3 miles away tending horses for a man who was going to use him and throw him away. "What's Holt's connection to Copper Bluff?" she asked. Cole was quiet for a moment. He sat back in his chair and crossed his arms and looked at the map. "Holt moves money," he said. "Not cattle, not furs, not freight. He moves money that needs to change hands without being traced. He's been doing it for 10 years for a variety of people." A pause. "In 1881, a man in Copper Bluff had a problem. He had taken money that didn't belong to him, public money, money that the families of that town had contributed for a civic building fund, and he needed that money to disappear before anyone could prove he had taken it." Nora's hands were flat on the table. She was very careful to keep her breathing even. "So he hired Holt," she said. "So he hired Holt. Holt's people moved the money out of the territory, and then to make sure the records couldn't be found, the treasury was burned." Cole's voice was level and matter-of-fact. "The fire spread faster than it was supposed to. 3 people were in the building." "They were supposed to be empty," Nora said. Cole looked at her. "The buildings," she said. Her voice was steady, though she was not sure how. "When a fire is set deliberately, the assumption is always that the building is empty. That's what people tell themselves. That's how they sleep." A pause. "Who were the 3 people?" "A night watchman named Greer, a young woman who worked as a clerk, Mary Sonder, and a man named Daniel Parrish." Cole held her gaze. "He was 25. From what I can find, he was engaged to be married." The room was very quiet. "To a woman named Calloway," Nora said. "Yes." She sat with this. She sat with all of it, the shape of what she had spent 3 years not letting herself fully know. And it settled over her like cold water, like the first real breath after a long time of breathing shallow. Daniel, who had proposed to her in the spring of 1881 with a ring that had belonged to his grandmother and a speech he had clearly rehearsed, which she had loved him for rather than teasing him about. Daniel, who had been the one person in Copper Bluff who had seen her as she actually was, capable and clear-headed and worth talking to, not just a woman waiting to become someone's wife. Daniel, who had been in the Treasury building on the night of the fire because He was finishing the evening accounts the way he always did, the way a conscientious young man finishes the work that needs finishing. Gerald Calloway had been the treasurer of Copper Bluff. Gerald Calloway had embezzled the building fund and hired Decker Holt to move the money and burn the building, and the fire had killed the man his daughter loved. Nora stood, she went to the window and looked out at the valley, dark now, the stars beginning. Cole waited. He did not speak, and he did not come to her, and she was grateful for both. She stood at the window for a long time. "Does he know?" she said finally. "My father. Does he know I know?" "I don't think he knows the full extent of what you know," Cole said carefully. "But I believe he suspects you're a risk to him. I think that's part of why he arranged what he arranged this morning." A pause. "You were not just a debt to be settled, Nora. You were a witness to be controlled." She pressed her palm flat against the cold glass of the window. "Thomas doesn't know any of this," she said. "No. That's why Holt recruited him, to have leverage over my father, or leverage over me if I became a problem." "That's my read," Cole said. She turned from the window. Cole was sitting at the table with the map between his hands, watching her with those still gray eyes that had the quality she was beginning to understand, not of coldness, but of steadiness. A man who could hold difficult things without needing to put them down. "I have to get Thomas out," she said. "Yes, and my father has to be held responsible." Her voice was quiet and certain, not angry past anger. "Not because I want revenge, because those families in Copper Bluff contributed their money in good faith, and 3 people died for it. They deserve justice." Cole looked at her for a long moment. "I agree," he said. "Can you do that?" she said. "Without Pinkerton, without official jurisdiction. Can you actually bring this to someone who will act on it?" Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know a federal judge, Harlan Webb. He's been investigating territorial corruption for 2 years, and he has jurisdiction that goes above the county level. If I can get him a complete case evidence, testimony, documented chain of money, he can act." A pause. "It won't be fast, but it will be real." Nora looked at him. "And you trust this man?" "I trust him more than I trust most." Something moved briefly through his face, an old pain, old and acknowledged and carried. "He's one of the reasons I left Pinkerton. He told me there were better ways to work. I didn't believe him then." A pause. "I'm starting to." Outside, the wind moved through the pines on the valley wall. A high, clean sound, the sound of a place that was very old and did not concern itself with the difficulties of small human lives. Nora sat down across from Cole and folded her hands on the table and looked at the map. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. They talked for another hour, the practicalities of what needed doing, what evidence existed and where, how to approach the camp for Thomas, how to keep Gerald Calloway from bolting before the case was complete. It was the conversation of 2 people working on a problem, careful and thorough, and Nora found to her surprise that she was good at this kind of thinking, that the same mind that had kept a general store's books and managed a difficult man's household for 24 years was useful here, organized and precise and unafraid of ugly answers. Cole noticed. She could see him noticing the slight adjustment in how he spoke to her, less explanatory, more collaborative. She filed that away too. When it was late and the fire had burned low, Cole said, "There's one more thing you should know." She looked at him. "The reason I left Pinkerton," he said. His voice was level, but the words were careful, the way a person is careful with something they carry close to bone. "I had a younger brother, Daniel." He paused, and she felt the coincidence of the name like a cold hand. "He was 22. He was taken by a land agent who was also running a kidnapping operation, extorting families for their sons. Pinkerton knew about the operation. The man running it had paid for protection." A pause. "Pinkerton told me to stand down, that the case was sensitive, that there were larger interests. The fire was very low." "I didn't stand down," Cole said, "but I was too late." He looked at the table. "My brother died in custody before I could get to him." A longer pause. "I burned my badge in the alley outside the Denver office. I haven't looked back." Nora sat with this. She sat with the weight of it, this man and his brother, and the organization that chose its interests over a 22-year-old life. And she understood now the fullness of why he had stepped into that street in Laramie Falls, and why he had not explained himself, and why he lived alone in a mountain valley with a case file and a mule and a set of cracked Pinkerton manuals. "I'm sorry," she said, "about Daniel." Cole nodded once. "That's why you work alone," she said. "Partly." He looked up at her. "Partly because working alone is the only way to be sure that nobody else gets to decide when you're done. She understood that. Cole, she said. He waited. When you saw me today, she said carefully, in that street, was it only about the investigation, the potential witness? He held her gaze for a long moment. He seemed to be deciding something, or to have already decided it, and to be finding the right words. No, he said. Just that. She looked at him across the low fire, this man who had traded a year's work for her freedom and not asked her for anything in return, and she felt something she had not expected to feel. Not gratitude, not relief, but something older and less comfortable than either. Recognition. She stood and said good night and climbed the ladder to the loft. She lay in the narrow bed and looked at the window, at the stars through the small square of cold glass, and she thought about Daniel Parrish, and about Thomas, and about Cole Maddox, and about her father, and about the strange geometry of how all of it had come to rest here in a hidden valley in the Ridgeback Mountains, where a fire burned low and a man she barely knew had looked at her across the coals and said no without flinching. Below her, Cole added one more piece of wood to the fire. The valley was very quiet. Nora closed her eyes, and for the second night in a row, she slept without fear. Morning came into the valley the way mornings come into hidden places all at once, and gold-edged the sun cresting the east ridge and laying a long stripe of light across the valley floor that moved slowly toward the cabin like something deliberate. Nora was awake before it reached the wall. She had been awake for some time, listening to the sounds of the valley, the creek, the wind in the pines, the particular silence of a place where no other people lived, and feeling the weight of what she had learned the night before settle into her bones. The way cold settles not painfully but completely until it is simply part of the temperature of you. Her father had burned a building. He had burned it knowing she was going to marry a man who worked inside it, and the fire had killed Daniel, and Gerald Calloway had come home to Copper Bluff 3 days later and told her there had been an accident and held her while she cried and said it was a terrible tragedy and a terrible loss. She tried to locate some feeling about this that was larger than the cold, flat fact of it, and she could not. It was too large for feeling. It sat in her chest like a stone that was not going anywhere, and she breathed around it and waited for the light to come. When she climbed down from the loft, Cole was already up a fire-going coffee on the hook. He was sitting at the table with the ledger open, writing in the careful hand of a man accustomed to keeping records. And he glanced up when she came down the ladder and said, "Good morning," with the ease of a person who had been living alone for a long time and had learned to manage the ordinary moments of another person's presence without making them strange. She took the second chair. He pushed the coffee toward her without being asked. They sat for a while in the early light, and the fire was warm and the valley outside was very quiet. "I want to see the evidence you have," she said. He looked at her across the table. "On my father," she said. "Whatever you've gathered, I want to see it." "It may be difficult," he said, not warning her off, giving her the information. "I know what it is," she said. "I've known the shape of it for 3 years. I've just been refusing to look directly at it." She set her cup down. "I'm done doing that." Cole closed the ledger and went to the shelf above the fireplace and brought down a flat oilskin package tied with twine. He set it on the table and untied it and spread the contents out carefully. Bank transfer records, telegrams, a signed receipt from a freight company in Denver for a large cash shipment, a statement from the fire marshal's report noting that the origin of the fire had been the office floor where no flame source was kept. 2 sworn affidavits from Copper Bluff residents describing seeing Gerald Calloway enter the building the evening of the fire. And one other thing, a photograph small and slightly blurred in the way photographs are when the subject is not quite still, of a man standing in the doorway of a building that Nora recognized immediately. The Copper Bluff Municipal Office. The man's face was turned slightly away from the camera, but she knew the set of those shoulders. She had watched them her whole life. She sat with the photograph in her hands for a long moment. Then she placed it back on the table with the others, and she looked up at Cole. "What do you still need?" she said. Cole watched her carefully. "Your testimony," he said. You kept his books in Copper Bluff. If you're willing to testify about the discrepancy you found in the accounts before the fire, and to identify the handwriting on the transfer records as his, it closes the gap between what I can prove circumstantially and what a federal judge can act on." "I found a discrepancy," she said. "I know." "How do you know?" "Because I've read 3 years of your father's bookkeeping, and the numbers are impeccable until 1881. And then there's a single 3-month period where 2 sets of books appear to have existed." He paused. "A careful bookkeeper made the original set. A frightened man made the second. The handwriting in the second set is less controlled. tighter, like someone writing in a hurry. Nora thought about that spring. She thought about the way her father had started locking the back office, which he had never done before. The way he had started being at the store before her in the mornings, which was also new. The way she had come in one Tuesday in March and found him burning papers in the backyard stove, and he had looked up at her with a face so carefully assembled into blankness that she had known instantly something was wrong, and just as instantly decided not to know what. She had been 21 years old and already so tired. "I'll testify," she said. Cole nodded. She stood and went to the window and looked out at the valley. Morning light bright on the stone of the east ridge, the pine trees dark and straight below it. 3 miles away, Thomas was waking up in Decker Holt's camp, tending horses, not knowing what he was standing in the middle of. "How do we get Thomas out?" she said. Cole came to stand a few feet behind her. Not close the same careful distance he always maintained, but near enough that she could hear him without turning. "Carefully," he said. "Holt knows Thomas came from Laramie Falls. He doesn't yet know the connection to your father's history or to you. If Holt learns that Thomas is the son of the man he worked for in 1881, he becomes leverage. We have to move before that connection is made." "How long do we have?" "Days, maybe less. Holt is not a patient man, and he's been sitting in that valley for 2 months. He'll move soon." Nora turned from the window. "Then we move first." Cole looked at her with those gray eyes. "There's a risk," he said. "If Holt decides Thomas is worth more as a hostage than as a horse tender, the situation changes fast." "I know." She held his gaze. "I'm not asking you to eliminate the risk. I'm asking you to help me manage it." Something shifted in his face briefly, the almost invisible movement of a man who is not accustomed to being spoken to as an equal and is finding that he prefers it. "All right," he said. They spent the morning planning, Cole spreading the survey map across the table and walking her through the topography of Holt's camp, the approaches and the sight lines, the positions of the sentries he had observed in his weeks of watching. He spoke precisely and without condescension, and Nora listened with the same mind she had always brought to the general store's problems, organized and practical and focused on the outcome. She also listened to what he did not say. He did not say that she should wait at the cabin while he handled it. He did not suggest that the plan required her to stay behind. He talked to her as he would talk to a partner, with the understanding that she was part of the operational thinking, not a person to be managed around it. She had not expected that. She found it changed things she had not realized needed changing. In the afternoon, they walked the lower trail together, not going as far as Holt's camp, but far enough to confirm Cole's map readings against the actual terrain. He was quiet as he moved, the practiced quiet of a man in observation mode, and Nora found that she could match it, that the years of moving carefully through a difficult household had given her, among other things, the ability to go through the world without drawing attention. Cole noticed. "You move well," he said at one point, when they had stopped in the shadow of a boulder to watch a deer and her fawn pick their way through a stand of aspen 100 yards below. "I had practice," she said. He looked at her sidelong. "In Copper Bluff, in my father's house," she said simply. He nodded. He understood without needing more. That evening, they came back to the cabin in the last light, the valley going purple and gold around them, and Cole made supper with the same efficient competence he brought to everything, and Nora set the table and brewed coffee, and they ate without hurrying. The fire was warm and the food was plain, and the conversation was occasional and unhurried, moving from the practical to the personal and back again, the way conversations do when two people are learning the shape of each other. She told him about her mother. He told her about his brother a little more this time, the way Daniel had laughed, a sudden helpless laugh that was completely at odds with the serious face he kept for strangers. He laughed like he was surprised by it every time, Cole said. He was looking at the fire and his voice was even, but the evenness cost something. Like he could never quite believe something was funny enough to make him do that. Nora watched him. "You miss him every day," she said. Yes, no hesitation, no performance of stoicism, just the word. She thought about Daniel Parrish, and the rehearsed proposal, and the ring that had belonged to his grandmother. She thought about what it meant to lose a person who saw you clearly. "I understand that," she said, and it was not a courtesy either. Cole looked at her across the fire. He looked at her with the directness that she had learned in these 2 days was not coldness, but attention. A man who paid full attention to what was in front of him because he had learned that the cost of not paying attention was permanent. "Are you angry?" he asked. "About Daniel, about what your father did." She considered the question honestly. "I think I've been angry for 3 years without knowing what I was angry at," she said. "It's a strange thing. I was grieving him and angry at myself for grieving because grief means you believed in something and believing in things had stopped feeling safe. She looked at her hands. Now I know what to be angry at. That's almost easier. Cole was quiet for a moment, then almost. Almost, she agreed. They sat with the fire between them, and the night was very still outside. And in the quietness, Nora felt something she had been bracing against begin very slightly to ease. She had spent 3 years keeping her back straight and her chin level surviving through sheer careful self-control, spending her emotions the way a person in a siege spends water sparingly, only what was necessary. She was very tired from it. Being here in this place with this man who did not need her to perform anything for him, who asked direct questions and gave direct answers, and did not seem to require her to be smaller or quieter or more manageable than she was a particular kind of rest she had not known she needed. It frightened her, that was honest. She recognized that it frightened her because needing something meant it could be taken away. She looked at Cole and found him watching her with a particular quality of attention that meant he had seen her think something and was waiting to find out whether she would say it. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "Back in Laramie Falls, when you stepped in." She looked at him steadily. "Was there a moment when you considered not doing it, walking past?" Cole was quiet for a long time. The fire settled. "There was a moment," he said, "when I calculated the part." A pause. A year's furs, the delay to the investigation, the complication of another person. He looked at his hands. "There was a moment when I ran through all of that. And then? And then I looked at your face," he said, "and the calculation stopped mattering." The room was very still. Nora looked at this man across the fire and felt the recognition she had felt the night before, deeper now, less surprising, more settled. "I don't know what to do with that," she said honestly. "Neither do I," he said, with the same honesty. They sat with the acknowledged strangeness of it for a while, and then Cole stood and said he would take a last walk around the perimeter before dark, and Nora said she would be up reading, and neither of them said anything more about what had passed. But it had passed, and they both knew it. The next morning, Cole left before first light to take a careful look at Holt's camp, a regular observation he had been conducting every few days, and Nora spent the morning in the cabin, doing something she had not done in a very long time. She sat at the table with a piece of paper and a pen, and she wrote a letter to Thomas. She wrote it 3 times before she found the version that was right. The first was too careful. All strategy and logistics, the letter of a person managing a situation. The second was too raw, all grief and anger, spilling out of her at her father at Decker Holt, at the years of not knowing. The third was simply honest. She told him she was safe and that she was near. She told him she was working with someone she had come to trust. She told him that what she needed from him was patience and that she would explain everything when she could. She told him she was proud of him not for going with Holt, but for the reason he had gone, because the reason was love even if the method was wrong. She told him that love that tries even badly was still love. She did not tell him about their father. That was a conversation that required a face, not a letter. She folded the letter and held it in her hands. She could not send it, not safely, not yet. But writing it helped. It made Thomas real and present in a way he had been slipping away from her, becoming in her imagination more victim than person. And he was not a victim. He was a 16-year-old boy who was proud and stubborn and made bad decisions for good reasons, and he was going to be all right. She was going to make sure of it. She set the letter inside the ledger she was not supposed to touch, and then took it back out and put it in her coat pocket instead, where it made a small, warm weight against her ribs. Cole returned at mid-morning, and one look at his face told her something had changed. He set his coat on the hook and came to the table and stood with his hands flat on the map, and he said without preamble, "Holt's moving, 2, maybe 3 days." Nora sat very still. "Where?" "South. He's got a meeting in Laramie Falls with a buyer." A pause. "The buyer is your father." She absorbed this. "What is my father selling?" "The remaining documentary evidence from Copper Bluff," Cole said. "Things he held back from Holt in 1881 as insurance. He's been holding them for 3 years, and now something has changed, some pressure I can't identify yet, and he's decided to sell them and be done with it." His gray eyes were steady. "Once those documents exchange hands and Holt destroys them, the case against your father becomes significantly harder to make." "When is the meeting?" 4 days from now, at Pike's place." A pause. "Which means Holt's outfit breaks camp in the next 48 hours. Which means Thomas moves with them." "Yes." Nora stood. She paced to the window and back, thinking. "We can't wait," she said. "No. We have to get Thomas out before Holt breaks camp. And we have to stop the meeting or at minimum be present for it with someone who has the authority to act on what they witness. Yes, Cole said, that's the shape of it. She turned to face him. Can you reach Judge Webb before the meeting? I sent a telegram from Laramie Falls 4 days ago, he said. I was expecting to have more time. But if I send a rider to the telegraph station at Dry Fork, which is 20 miles south, I can get a message to Webb's circuit office within the day. He looked at her. The question is whether he can get someone here in 4 days. He needs to get himself here, Nora said. Not a deputy, the man himself with authority to arrest and hold. Because what's going to happen at that meeting that is not a crime someone else can witness and report later? It has to be witnessed by someone who can act on it in the moment. Cole looked at her for a long time. You've thought about this carefully, he said. I've had 3 years of not thinking about it, she said. It comes out fast when you finally do. He almost smiled. It was the same almost smile she had seen once before, brief and quickly gone, but present. I'll write the telegram tonight, he said. Send a rider at first light. He looked back at the map. That leaves us tomorrow to get Thomas. The next morning was gray and cold. The first real suggestion of autumn in the air. The light flat and coming from everywhere at once, the way it comes when a high overcast has moved in overnight. Cole and Nora left the cabin at sunrise, traveling the lower trail in single file, Cole ahead, reading the terrain, Nora behind carrying a second pack with provisions and an extra coat for Thomas. They moved in silence for most of an hour. At the edge of the pine break, Cole stopped and gestured her up beside him. Through the trees, 300 yards ahead and below, she could see the smoke of Holt's camp thin and pale against the gray sky. He turned to her and spoke very quietly. There's a sentry on the north side, rotates every 2 hours. Last rotation was 40 minutes ago. There are 7 men in the camp, including Thomas. Holt himself is usually inside the large tent during the morning unless something draws him out. He met her eyes. Thomas tends the remuda in a rope corral on the east side of the camp. It's the farthest point from Holt's tent. Nora looked through the trees at the smoke. I go in, she said. Cole had known this was coming. She could see that he had known it, the particular set of his jaw. That meant he had already argued through his objections and arrived at the same conclusion she had. If I go in as a stranger, it draws attention and it draws Holt. If you go in as Thomas's sister, there's a story that explains your presence. Yes, she said. And if it goes wrong, he said, I'm at the North Sentry Post. The moment anything changes, you get Thomas and you go east. The creek runs east, you follow it 300 yards to the stone ford, and you cross there and go north. Don't wait for me. Cole, promise me, he said. She looked at him. He was looking at her with the direct, full attention gray eyes, and she understood that this was not a performance of protectiveness, not a man asserting ownership or control, but a person who had lost a brother and who was looking at another person he was unwilling to lose. I promise, she said. He held her gaze for a moment, and then he nodded and turned toward the north tree line, and Nora walked out of the pines toward Holt's camp. She walked as though she belonged there, the way she had learned to walk through any space where she was not wanted, but was pretending to be expected with purpose and without apology. A young man tending horses in the east corral looked up when she came around the tent line, and he was not Thomas, and she kept walking, and then she came around the corner of the rope corral, and she saw her brother. He was brushing down a gray mare, his back to her, working with the practiced patience of a boy who has learned that animals respond to patience in a way that people often don't. He was taller than she remembered. 2 months had done something to his shoulders, broadened them slightly the way outdoor work does to young men. Thomas, she said quietly. He spun around. His face went through 4 different things in the space of 2 seconds. Surprise, relief, guilt, and a determined attempt at composure that was entirely him, the same face he had made at 9 years old when she had found him crying over their mother. And he had tried to pretend he was fine. Nora, he said, his voice was low. What are you doing here? I came to get you, she said. She kept her voice easy as though she were speaking about something ordinary. Get your kit. His jaw set. I've got work to do. Thomas? She looked at him steadily. This isn't a cattle operation and you know it. You've known it for at least 3 weeks. I need you to trust me right now and we can have the full argument later. His eyes were moving over her face, reading it the way he had always been able to read her, and she let him kept her face as open as she could manage. Are you all right? He said. I'm better than I was 2 days ago, she said. Come on. He hesitated. She saw him calculate the same way she always calculated the cost versus the return, the risk of staying against the risk of going. "There's a man," he said. "I've been watching the camp. He's been watching too." "Cole Maddox," she said. "He's with me." Thomas stared at her. "How long have you known Cole Maddox?" "3 days." His expression did something that under other circumstances would have been funny. "Nora, I'll explain everything," she said. "I promise. But we need to go now." He looked at her for one more moment. Then he reached under the corral rail and pulled out a rolled canvas pack that was already assembled as though some part of him had been ready to leave for some time. "This way," he said. They moved along the east edge of the camp, Thomas leading because he knew the layout, Nora a step behind. The camp was quiet in the gray morning, most of the men not yet moving. They reached the east end of the corral and turned north into the trees. A voice said, "Where are you headed, son?" They both stopped. The man standing between them and the tree line was not a sentry she recognized from Cole's description. He was lean and dark-suited, someone who looked like he spent more time in buildings than in camps. And he was standing with his hands in his coat pockets and looking at them both with an expression of mild and dangerous interest. Decker Holt. Nora had not expected him to look like this. She had built up an image of him from what she knew: a rough camp operator, an outdoor man, someone who matched the Ridgeback country. The man in front of her was none of those things. He was controlled and well-dressed, and his eyes were the careful eyes of a man who spent his life identifying the exact weight of every situation he entered. Those eyes moved from Thomas to Nora, and she watched him make connections. "Calloway's daughter," he said. It was not a question. Nora kept her voice level. "I came to collect my brother." "Did you?" Holt looked at Thomas with something almost like regret, the expression of a man setting aside a useful tool. "Your timing is interesting, Miss Calloway. Your father and I have a meeting in 4 days." He paused. "He told me he had 2 children, a daughter and a son. He said the daughter was settled." Another pause. "He said she was not a complication." Nora felt the cold stone in her chest shift. "He was wrong," she said. Holt smiled. It was the smile of a man who found situations intellectually interesting and had no particular emotional investment in the people inside them. "I think he may have been wrong about several things," he said. "Come back to the camp, both of you. We have things to discuss." He stepped toward them. The shot went into the dirt, 2 feet to his left. Holt stopped. His hands came out of his pockets, open and visible. Cole Maddox stepped out of the tree line, and he was holding his rifle with the easy certainty of a man who does not fire warning shots as a regular practice, and has used this one only because the situation called for a demonstration rather than a resolution. "The children are leaving," Cole said. Holt looked at him with those careful eyes assessing. "Maddox," he said. The name came out with recognition. "You know me," Cole said. "I know of you," Holt said. "Ex-Pinkerton, independent contractor, been in the Ridgeback for 3 months." A pause, and something shifted in his eyes, a narrowing that was not fear but recalibration. "You've been watching my camp." "I have," Cole said. "All on. And everything I've seen goes into the package that reaches Judge Harlan Webb within the week." He held Holt's gaze. "Unless you want to have a conversation about terms." Holt was quiet for a long moment. The camp was still behind him. None of his men had appeared at the noise of the shot, which told Nora either that they had not heard it or that Holt ran an outfit where a single shot did not automatically bring everyone running. "What terms?" Holt said finally. "Step back," Cole said. "Let them go. When Webb arrives, you cooperate with the inquiry into the Copper Bluff matter. Your name comes up in connection with the money movement, not the fire itself." A pause. "The fire is on the man who hired you. You deliver him to Webb, and your sentence is substantially reduced." Holt looked at Cole for a long time. Then he looked at Nora. "Your father," he said. "Yes," she said. Something moved through Holt's face that she had not expected to see there. Something close to respect, or perhaps the particular acknowledgement one professional extends to another. "I've been carrying that job for 3 years," he said. "It's a loose end I would prefer to have tied." "Help us tie it," Cole said, "and it's done." Holt looked at them both for a long moment. Then he stepped aside. Thomas needed no second invitation. He moved through the cab and Nora followed, and Cole backed steadily toward the trees, keeping Holt in his field of vision until the tree line closed between them. They moved quickly through the pines north toward the creek, Thomas's pack bouncing against his back. He was breathing fast, more from adrenaline than exertion. "Who is that man?" Thomas said, low and urgent. "I told you," Nora said. "Cole Maddox. He just talked Decker Holt down with 2 sentences. "Yes." Thomas looked at his sister, And she looked back at him and something passed between them that was the compressed shorthand of people who have spent years reading each other under difficult circumstances. You like him, Thomas said. I trust him, Nora said. That's enough for now. They reached the stone ford and crossed it, the cold water coming up to their boots, the creek running fast with the week's recent rains. On the far bank, Cole fell in beside them, and they moved north toward the valley, and the gray light was beginning to break above the eastern ridge, a thin line of silver that promised afternoon sun. Nobody said anything for a long time. Then Thomas said quietly, "You came for me." "Of course I came for you," Nora said. He was quiet for another moment. "I'm sorry," he said, "for going." "I know," she said. She put her hand briefly on his arm. "We'll talk about it later." He nodded and kept walking, and the mountain country opened around them, wide-eyed and old and indifferent to the small urgencies of the human beings picking their way through it. And Nora walked between her brother and the man who had spent a year's work on her freedom, and she felt the cold stone in her chest begin very slowly to change shape. Not gone, but changing. Like ice at the first hint of spring, just beginning to understand that the season is different now. Back at the cabin, Cole brewed coffee while Thomas sat at the table looking at the survey map with the focused silence of a boy who was processing a great deal at once. Nora set the extra coat she had brought for Thomas on the shelf and stood by the window for a moment looking out at the valley. "I need to tell him," she said quietly to Cole. Cole at the fire looked at her. "About my father," she said. "About Copper Bluff." He was quiet for a moment. "That's your call," he said. "He has to know. He's going to see Gerald in 4 days. He needs to understand what kind of man he's looking at." Cole nodded. He poured 2 cups of coffee and set them on the table, and then he took his own cup and went to the doorway and stood looking out at the valley, giving them room. Nora sat down across from Thomas. He looked up at her, and in his face she could see both the child she had raised and the young man he was becoming, and she loved both of them with the fierce, unconditional love of a person who has been someone else's whole family. "Thomas," she said, "I have to tell you something about Pa." She told him plainly. She told him about the building fund and the embezzlement and the fire. She told him about Daniel. She told him about the photograph and the bank records and what Gerald Calloway had done with 3 years of her grief and silence. Thomas listened without interrupting. His face went through things she could not fully read, and she let it because these were his things to feel and she had no right to manage them. When she finished, the cabin was very quiet. "Daniel Parrish," Thomas said. He had met Daniel twice. He had liked him. "Yes," she said. A long silence. "He knew," Thomas said. "When you were grieving, he knew what he'd done." "Yes." Thomas's jaw tightened. "And he held you while you cried," he said. "He told you it was a tragedy." "Yes." Thomas stood. He went to the window where Cole was no longer standing and looked out at the valley for a long time. Nora waited. "What happens to him?" Thomas said finally. "Judge Webb will hear the case," Nora said. "Cole has documented evidence. I'll testify. If Holt cooperates, the chain of evidence is complete." She paused. "He'll be tried, properly, under federal jurisdiction. And if he runs, Cole has thought about that," she said. "There are steps." Thomas turned from the window. He looked at his sister with an expression that was older than 16 and younger than it had any right to be both of those things at once, the way a person looks when they are growing up faster than they planned. "Nora," he said, "I'm sorry I left." She stood and crossed to him and put her arms around him the way she had when he was 9, and the grief was too big, and neither of them knew how to carry it yet. "You came back," she said. "That's what matters." He held on for a moment, and then he let go, and they both straightened, and the afternoon light came through the window onto the plank floor of the cabin, and somewhere outside, Cole was walking the valley perimeter, giving them their time. That evening, the 3 of them sat at the table together, and Cole explained the plan for the next 4 days. He was methodical and clear, and he included Thomas in the planning without condescension, which Thomas noticed. Nora watched her brother begin to calibrate Cole Maddox with the careful, accurate assessment of a young man who had spent his life around difficult men and knew the real thing from the performance. After the plan was laid out, Thomas asked Cole one question. "Why are you doing this?" Cole looked at him. "Because it needs doing," he said, "and I'm in a position to do it." Thomas nodded. He sat with this. "That's a good answer," he said finally. Cole looked at him. "Your sister said the same thing," he said, "when I helped her." Thomas looked at his sister. She looked back at him. "Did you ask her why she was going north with a stranger?" Thomas said. "I asked why she was going north," Cole said. "I already knew she wasn't a person who did things without a reason." Thomas sat back in his chair. He looked from his sister to Cole and back again, with the slow, deliberate expression of a 16-year-old boy doing accurate arithmetic. All right, he said. He did not say anything else on the subject. That night, Nora lay in the loft and listened to the quiet sounds of the cabin below, Thomas's breathing on the floor near the fire, Cole's stillness near the door, the valley outside alive with the sounds of the mountain night. She thought about what was coming, the meeting at Pike's, her father arriving with documents he had been hoarding for 3 years, documents that represented the last of his leverage, the final thread between himself and a reckoning. The look on his face when he saw not Holt waiting for him, but a federal judge. She thought about what it would mean to be done with it, to have it over, settled, accounted for. She thought about what came after. She was not afraid of after. That was new. She pressed the letter to Thomas in her coat pocket, the one she had not needed to send, and she held it there for a moment, this small paperweight, and she thought about all the things she had written and not sent over the years, all the things she had known and not said, all the life she had lived sideways to protect herself from the cost of living it straight. She was done with that. She put the letter back in her pocket and closed her eyes, and the night was quiet and she slept. The morning of the third day broke clear and hard. The overcast burned away overnight, leaving a sky of deep October blue that arched over the Ridgeback Valley like something newly made. Nora stood outside the cabin in the cold and looked at the sky for a long time. The rider Cole had sent to Dry Fork had returned the previous evening with a single-word telegram, coming 2 days. Webb. 2 days. Cole had read the telegram once and set it on the table and nodded with the brief economy of a man who has been working toward a thing for a long time and can see the end of the road now, not close enough to reach, but visible. Today was a waiting day. Tomorrow would be a moving day. The day after that, her father would walk into Pike's gambling house, expecting to sell the last of his secrets to a man who had already agreed to testify against him. Nora breathed the cold morning air and felt the shape of what was coming with the particular clarity that comes before action when everything uncertain has become decided, and all that remains is the execution. Thomas came out of the cabin behind her, pulling his coat on, and stood beside her, looking at the sky. "I've been thinking," he said. "I know," she said. "I could hear it." He almost smiled. "I want to be there," he said, "when it happens, at Pike's." She had known he would say this. "No," she said. "Nora." "Thomas." She turned to look at him. "I need you somewhere else, somewhere safer." "He's our father," Thomas said. The word came out with the complicated weight it deserved, not a defense of Gerald, but an acknowledgement that the word still meant something, even now, even given everything. "I know," she said, "and when it's over, we'll decide together what we want that relationship to look like, if we want it at all. But at Pike's tomorrow, I need you to not be there." She held his gaze. "Because if Gerald sees you, he'll use you. That's what he does. He finds the thing you care about, and he uses it." A pause. "He's done it my entire life." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "He did it to you this whole time," he said slowly. "You stayed because of me, Bantu, because you didn't want him to take out whatever was wrong on me." She had not planned to have this conversation now in the cold morning, with everything else about to happen. But Thomas's face was open and waiting with the particular directness of a person who has decided to stop looking away. "Yes," she said. He stood with this for a long moment. His jaw worked. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't know. You weren't supposed to know. You were 9. She put her hand briefly on his arm. "Thomas, none of it was your fault. None of it." He nodded. He was fighting something. She could see the fight. The 16-year-old who wanted to be past feeling this way, and the grieving person who was not past it yet. "Okay," he said finally. "What do you need me to do?" Cole had found a family, and the Hargrove family, who ran a small cattle operation 2 valleys south, decent people he had traded with over the years. He rode out that morning and came back at noon with an arrangement. Thomas would stay with the Hargroves for 2 days out of the way and safe, and in exchange, Cole would look at a fence line they needed repairing. Thomas packed his kit without argument, which was itself a form of trust. At the cabin doorway before he left with Cole, he turned to Nora. "The letter," he said. She stared at him. "In your coat pocket," when he said. "I can see the shape of it. You've had it since you got here." He looked at her steadily. "Is it for me?" She reached into her pocket and took out the letter she had written 3 days ago in the morning quiet of the empty cabin, and she held it for a moment, and then she gave it to him. He took it and looked at it, her handwriting on the outside. "Thomas, read it after," she said. "When it's done." He put it in his own pocket. He nodded. Cole brought the horses around and Thomas climbed up and they rode south and Nora stood in the valley and watched them go and let herself feel for a few minutes the full weight of what she was carrying, all of it at once, not managed or distributed or held at a careful distance, just felt. It was heavy. She had always known it was heavy. She took a breath and then another, and then she went inside and built up the fire and sat at Cole's table with the evidence file open in front of her and went through every document one more time, checking her memory of the account discrepancies, preparing her testimony with the same meticulous care she had always brought to numbers. She would be ready. Cole returned at dusk. He stood in the doorway and looked at her at the table with the paper spread before her, and she saw something move through his face, something he did not bother to conceal, which she had come to understand was its own form of statement from a man who was precise about everything he did. "Thomas is settled," he said. "The Hargroves are good people." "Thank you," she said. He came in and sat across from her and looked at the papers. "How are you?" It was a simple question. Most people asked it without expecting a real answer. Cole asked it with his full gray-eyed attention, and she had come to understand that he always expected the real answer. "Afraid," she said, "and ready, both at once." "That's the right combination," he said. "Fear keeps you precise. Ready keeps you moving." She looked at him. "Is that something you learned at Pinkerton?" "I learned it later," he said. After his brother, after the badge burned in the alley in Denver." "Cole," she said. He waited. "After tomorrow," she said, "what do you do?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Webb will take the case forward. There will be hearings, testimony, legal process. It'll take months." He looked at the table. "I'll be needed for that. Here, part of the time, circuit rides to wherever Webb's court sits." She looked at the survey map pinned above the fireplace at the small X marking Holt's camp at the line of the trail, north to the ridgeback. At the cabin marked in pencil, the mark Cole had drawn himself of his own place in this country. "And this valley," she said. He looked at her with those steady gray eyes. "This valley stays," he said. "It's home." The words settled in the room between them. She looked at him for a long moment and he looked back, and neither of them said the thing they both understood because the time for it was not yet, and they were both people who had learned to wait for the right time, who had spent their lives not rushing what needed to be slow. But it was there. She felt it, and she knew he felt it, a thing that had been growing in the spaces between the practical and the urgent, in the firelight conversations, in the trail silences, in the steady exchange of difficult truths, a thing that had nothing to do with gratitude or rescue or debt. Something chosen, mutual and equal and chosen. "All right," she said. She looked back at the papers. "Then let's make sure tomorrow goes the way it needs to." Tomorrow. They left before first light. The trail south was cold in the dark, the stars still out, the horses' breath coming in white clouds that dissolved behind them as they rode. Cole had outlined the plan 3 times, and each time Nora had asked the right questions, and he had answered them, and by the 3rd time, neither of them needed to speak it again, because it lived in their bodies now. The sequence of it, the positions, the contingencies. Laramie Falls came into view at first gray light, the building still dark except for the lamp in the window of the livery. They circled wide of the main street and came in from the south through the back lot behind the freight office and tied the horses in the alley behind the church. Cole checked his watch. "Webb should be at the hotel," he said. "He telegraphed from Dry Fork last night." "Does he know about Holt's cooperation?" "I sent word." She looked at him. "And if Holt doesn't come—" "He'll come," Cole said. "Holt wants the Copper Bluff job off his record. He needs to deliver your father in person to make that happen." A pause. "He'll come." They crossed the back lots to the Grand Laramie Hotel, and Cole went up the back stairs and was back down in 7 minutes. "Webb is here," he said. "He has 2 marshals." Nora exhaled. "He wants to meet you," Cole said, before. She looked at him. "Why?" "Because you're the primary witness," Cole said. "And because he wants to know you can hold under cross-examination. This will eventually go to trial, Nora. Hardcastle will fight it." "Let him," she said. Cole almost smiled. When Judge Harlan Webb was a small, dry man with the face of someone who had spent 30 years watching people lie to him and had developed in response the absolute stillness of someone who could wait out any deception. He had sharp gray eyes, not unlike Cole's, though where Cole's eyes were quiet, Webb's were active, cataloging. He asked her 3 questions. "First, Miss Calloway, what did you observe about the accounts in the spring of 1881? Second, did you raise your concerns with anyone at the time? Third, why not?" She answered the first 2 without difficulty. The third she sat with for a moment because the honest answer was complicated. "Because I was 21 years old," she said, And I was going to marry the man in the treasurer's office, and I thought when we were married, I would have the standing to ask the questions I needed to ask. And then the fire happened, and I lost that, and afterward, I couldn't ask because asking would mean knowing, and knowing would mean I had to do something, and I was alone and without resources, and I didn't know how to do something about my own father. She looked at Webb steadily. I know how now. Webb looked at her for a long moment. You'll do, he said, and it was the highest compliment he had available. The meeting was set for noon. Nora and Cole positioned themselves in the back room of the Grand Laramie Hotel through a connecting door from the adjoining building. Pike's establishment shared a wall with the hotel, and in that wall, Cole had known about a gap between the plaster and the outer boards where sound carried clearly. Webb and his marshals were positioned at the front and back doors. At 11:45, Nora heard the sound of boots on the front steps of Pike's. She pressed close to the wall and held herself very still. Her father's voice when she heard it was not the voice she remembered. He had a walk-in voice, the voice of a man accustomed to entering rooms and finding them already arranged to his convenience. He sounded tired and older and slightly less certain than she remembered the voice of a man who had been afraid for 3 years and had learned to carry his fear like furniture. Something you moved around every day until you forgot it wasn't supposed to be there. Holt, he said. A pause. Not Holt, said another voice. Silence. Gerald Calloway, said Judge Harlan Webb. You are under federal warrant for the crimes of embezzlement, arson, and 3 counts of manslaughter in the matter of the Copper Bluff Treasury fire of 1881. The sound that came through the wall was not a shout or a protest. It was a low, broken sound, the sound of a man understanding that the thing he had been running from for 3 years had finally set its hand on him. Cole's hand found hers in the dark of the back room. He held it briefly and she held back. Then she let go because there was still work to do. Decker Holt had come as Cole had predicted. He stood in the doorway of Pike's when the marshals brought Gerald Calloway out, and he watched with those careful, assessing eyes as the man who had hired him in 1881 was led across the street, and his face held the expression of a man closing a ledger. He looked at Nora. She had not expected to be standing on the street when they brought her father out. She had intended to stay back to let the law handle its own work. But her legs had carried her outside, and now she was standing on the steps of the Grand Laramie Hotel as the marshals walked Gerald Calloway across Main Street in the morning light. He saw her. He stopped walking, though the marshals did not let him stop for long. For one moment he looked at her with his tired, frightened, familiar face, and she looked at him, and she understood that she was waiting for something, some feeling that would organize all the others into a simple form, anger or grief or some final collapse of love. What she felt was simpler than any of those. She felt the long work of the years she had given him, and she let them go. Not forgiveness, not yet, perhaps not ever, but release. She had spent 24 years defined by what she owed him, what she had to be for him, what she could not afford to let herself know because of him. She was done. Gerald Calloway walked across the street in the morning light, and Nora stood on the steps and watched him go, and then she turned away. Cole was standing behind her. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment because everything that needed to be said had already been said in the cabin by the fire on the trail through the mountains, in the small exchanges of truth that had been building between them since a morning in August when a man she didn't know had stepped into a street in Laramie Falls and made the calculation and let it stop mattering. It's done, she said. The beginning of it, he said, and there's still the legal process. I know. She looked up at him. I'll be there for all of it. He held her gaze. I know, he said. There was a question in the air between them that they had been not asking for 4 days, and she was tired of not asking it. She had spent too much of her life being careful about the things she wanted. Cole, she said. Yes. I'm not going to Cheyenne, she said. I'm not going anywhere east. I want to stay. She looked at him steadily. In the valley, through the winter, through the legal process, however long it takes. A pause. I want to stay. He was very still for a moment. I want that too, he said. Simple words. No performance, no dramatics, no transaction. 2 people with clear eyes and complicated histories saying the plain thing. Then that's what we do, she said. Nah. They retrieved Thomas from the Hargroves that afternoon, riding south into the long golden fall light that turned the dry grass to amber and made the distant mountains look like something out of a painting that had never quite existed in the real world. Thomas rode between them, and he was quiet, and she could feel him processing, working through what had happened and what it meant, the way he had always processed things thoroughly and without shortcuts. At some point on the trail, he said, "What happens to Pa now?" Federal trial, Cole said. Webb's court. It'll take 6 months, maybe more. Will he go to prison? Most likely, Cole said. He did not soften it. Thomas nodded. He rode for another mile without speaking. Then the families in Copper Bluff, the ones who put money in the building fund, will they get anything back? Cole looked at him. Part of it, the documented funds can be recovered. The rest will depend on what assets your father has. The store, Thomas said. In Laramie Falls, it's worth something. Yes, Cole said. Thomas nodded again. Another mile. I think it should go to them, Thomas said. The families. He looked at Cole. Can that be arranged? Cole looked at him with those steady gray eyes. Yes, he said. I'll make sure Webb knows that's the family's position. Thomas nodded. He looked at his sister. She looked back at him. He's still our father, Thomas said. And I don't know how to stop that being true. But those people lost their money and Mary lost her brother and you lost Daniel. He looked straight ahead. We owe them what we can give. Nora reached it across and put her hand briefly on her brother's arm, and she felt the grief in it and the goodness, and she was proud of him in a way that was almost too large for the space she had for feelings. Yes, she said, we do. Right. They rode back into the Ridgeback Valley as the sun went down behind the western peaks. The valley in shadow below a sky that was still lit gold above, and the cabin was dark until Cole got down and went inside and got the fire going, and the light came through the window and spread into the evening outside. Nora stood by the horses with Thomas, and they unsaddled in the companionable silence of two people who have been through a hard day and know the end of it isn't near. He's a good man, Thomas said, not looking up from the cinch he was loosening. Nora looked at the cabin window. Yes, she said. You look at him different than you looked at anyone before. Thomas said, still with the same matter-of-fact tone as though he were discussing the weather or the condition of the trail. I feel different, she said simply. Thomas looked up at her. In the dying light, his face was younger and older than usual, both at the same time. Good, he said. He carried his saddle to the lean-to, and Nora carried hers, and they put the horses up for the night. And then they went inside where Cole had a fire going and coffee on, and the cabin was warm with the honest warmth of a place that has been lived in and cared for. That night, the three of them sat at the table and they ate, and the fire was warm, and outside the valley was very dark and very quiet. And inside there was the sound of ordinary life spoons against plates, and the occasional low exchange of words in the sound of the fire. After supper, Thomas pulled Nora's letter from his pocket. He looked at it for a moment without opening it. I read it already, he said, before at the Hargroves. She looked at him. You wrote, love that tries even badly is still love. He looked at the letter. I've been thinking about that all day. And, she said, he set the letter on the table between them. I think it's true, he said. I think it's true about both of us. He looked at his sister. We tried. For him. We tried as hard as we could for a long time. A pause, and it wasn't enough, but the trying was still real. Nora reached across and took his hand. Yes, she said, the trying was real. Cole across the table said nothing. He did not need to say anything. He was simply there, present and steady, the way he was always present and steady, and Nora felt that steadiness, the way you feel a foundation under your feet. Not dramatically, not with sudden realization, but in the quiet, continuous way of something reliable that you have begun without deciding to count on. Winter came early to the Ridgeback Valley that year. The first snow falling in early October light, at first a dusting on the pine tops and the stone of the ridge, and then settling into the serious business of a mountain winter deep and still incomplete. Nora learned the shape of it. She learned the rhythm of the valley, the way you learn the rhythms of a person you are becoming close to gradually. And from all sides, the particular way the wind came over the east ridge in the late afternoon, the creeks sound at different water levels, the order in which the aspens lost their leaves. She learned the work of winter preparation, the laying in of wood, the banking of snow around the cabin's base for insulation, the management of provisions that had to last until spring broke the high passes. Cole taught her as he had always taught, without condescension and without making her smallness in this knowledge feel like a failure. She was quick and she was careful, and she had, as he had noted once, with the quiet appreciation he gave to things he found genuinely good hands. She also taught him things, as it turned out. She was better with numbers than he was, meticulous in a way he appreciated, and she took over the management of the supply accounting and the case file records with an efficiency that freed him for the physical work of the winter preparation. She could read people with an accuracy he had not anticipated, a skill built from years of watching a dangerous man closely. And twice in the months of legal correspondence with Webb, She caught a problem in a deposition that Cole had nearly missed. Webb noted in a letter in November that Maddox's associate had a formidable legal mind. Cole read this aloud to Nora at the table, and she laughed for only the second or third time, and he found that each time it happened, he arranged himself more carefully toward making it happen again. Thomas stayed through October and into November, learning the mountain work with the speed of a young man who has found the thing his body was built for, and then in late November, he rode down to the lower valley and took work at the Hargrove spread, which had a barn that needed rebuilding and a forge that needed a capable pair of hands. He came back to the cabin on Sundays for supper. The day he left for the Hargroves, he shook Cole's hand with the serious formality of a young man conducting serious business. "You'll look after her," he said. "Not a question." "She doesn't need looking after," Cole said. "She needs a partner." Thomas looked at him for a moment. "Good answer," he said. The legal process moved the way legal processes move, slowly and with the grinding thoroughness of something that is going to be permanent. Gerald Calloway was indicted in November, arraigned in December, and committed for trial in the spring. Decker Holt provided a deposition that was, as Cole had predicted, comprehensive and specific, the testimony of a man who had decided that honesty was the most strategic available option. The Copper Bluff families received notice in January that a federal restitution proceeding had been opened. The store in Laramie Falls was liquidated, and the proceeds were allocated as Thomas had requested as the family's position per Cole's communication to Webb. It was not everything those families had lost. It was not Daniel Parrish or the watchman Greer or young Mary Sonder, who had been 19 and had worked in the Treasury for 6 months. It was not the years of Nora's grief or the shape of the life she had been supposed to have. But it was something real. It was accountability arrived at through the proper machinery of law, documented and inarguable and permanent. Nora wrote to the Sonder family in Copper Bluff. She did not know what she would say until she began writing, and then the words came in the plain, honest way that words come when you have stopped managing them. She told them about Mary, what she remembered, a girl who had smiled often and had been kind to the older women in the building fund meetings, who had brought her lunch in a basket with a cloth napkin that she folded and put back in the basket every day. She told them she was sorry. She told them that she had not known, and she told them that not knowing was not the same as not being responsible, because she had felt the wrongness in those spring months of 1881 and had not asked the question, and she had been too young and too tired and too afraid of what the answer would cost her, and she was sorry for that too. She did not know if the letter helped. She sent it anyway because some things needed to be said, even if you could not know what they did. A bomb. Winter deepened, and the valley was very white and very quiet. There was a morning in January when a snow fell overnight. That was the kind of snow that changes the world 2 feet deep and perfectly still, the kind that silences everything and makes the mountains look like they have been painted fresh. Nora woke to it and went to the window and saw the valley transformed, every surface clean and white, the creek a dark thread through the white, the pines dark green and heavy-shouldered with their loads. She dressed and went outside without waking Cole. She stood in the snow outside the cabin door in the cold blue morning and looked at the valley and felt the particular lightness of a world that has been covered over and made simple. She heard the door behind her, and Cole came out and stood beside her, and they looked at the valley together for a long time without speaking. She was not the person who had stood against the post on Main Street of Laramie Falls in August. She understood that she would never be that person again, not because that person had been bad or broken, but because she had come through something, and you do not come through something and remain unchanged. You come through it, and you are the person who came through, which is a different person, better, in some ways and changed in others, and carrying things both old and new. She thought about Daniel Parrish, and she let herself miss him fully, and without the protective distance she had kept for 3 years. She let herself know that she had loved him, and that she would have been happy with him, and that the life she had been supposed to have had been real, and it had mattered. And she let herself know that this life was also real and also mattered. Both things at the same time. Cole's hand found hers. She looked down at their hands and then up at his face and found him looking at her with the steady, full attention that she had learned was simply how he saw her, completely and without condition. "I want to ask you something," he said. She waited. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not because the legal case needs you here, and not because of Thomas, and not because of anything practical. I want you to stay because you're the person I want beside me." He looked at her steadily. "I know it's early. I know there's still the trial and Webb's proceedings and Thomas's work at the Hargroves and 100 practical things. I'm not asking you to decide any of that right now. A pause. I'm asking you to know that I'm asking. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about this girl who had stood against a post and told herself not to cry and spent 24 years being someone's obligation and then someone's tool and had never not once been asked. She thought about the letter to Thomas that she had written 3 times to get right and the third time had simply been honest. Cole, she said. He waited. I already stayed, she said. I stayed when I could have gone to Cheyenne. I stayed when the case was settled and there was no longer a practical reason. I stayed because this valley is the first place in my life where I've woken up every morning and not had to decide whether it was safe to be myself. She looked up at him. I stayed because of you. The morning was very white and very still. He raised his other hand and touched her face carefully the way he did everything without waste. And she turned into it, and when he kissed her, it was cold and warm at once. The cold of the winter morning and the warmth of the fire inside, and it felt like the plain truth of something that had been becoming true for a long time. When they pulled apart, she kept her hands in his and looked at the valley white and new, and waiting for what came next. I'm keeping my name, she said. He looked at her. Calloway, she said. I know that's unusual, but I want to keep it. Not for him, for me. Because I'm the one who walked out of Laramie Falls with it, and I want to be the one who decides what it means. Cole was quiet for a moment. Then that seems right to me, he said. She looked at him with something she recognized finally for what it was. Not gratitude, not relief, not the complicated debt of rescue. Love the kind that comes from knowing someone completely and choosing them anyway, choosing them every day with full knowledge of every cost. All right, she said. Bakasın. Spring came in May. The snow broke from the peaks and the creek ran high, and the valley turned green from the bottom up, pale green. At first, then deeper, the aspens coming in last, their leaves small and trembling in the mountain wind. Reverend Aldous Morris came through the lower valley in the first week of June, a circuit preacher who knew the mountain country and had married 3 couples in the Ridgeback over the years. He stayed 2 nights at the cabin. The ceremony took place on the second morning outside under the pines, with the creek visible through the trees and the mountains above it all, and the light coming in from the east, the way it always came into the valley all at once, and gold-edged and complete. Thomas stood to Nora's left, his hat in his hands, his face doing everything it always did, trying to be older than it was and failing in the best possible way. Mary Hargrove cried, though she had met Nora only twice, because Mary Hargrove cried at most things that seemed true, which was a quality Nora had come to find not embarrassing but admirable. Cole stood in his good clothes, which were not as good as the occasion perhaps demanded, but were honest, and he looked at Nora with the full gray-eyed attention he had always given her, seeing her completely, and she looked back at him the same way. When Morris asked if she took this man, she said, I do, in a voice that did not shake, because she had made this decision many times already in the cabin by the fire on the trail through the mountains, in the winter mornings by the window, and she was not shaking because she was sure. When Morris asked if Cole took this woman, Cole said, I do, and looked at her, and the words had the same quality they always had, level and deliberate in meaning exactly what they said. Morris pronounced them husband and wife, and said they could kiss, which they did briefly in the mountain way, without display, and Thomas exhaled audibly with relief, which made Nora laugh against Cole's mouth. And Cole pulled back and looked at her, laughing, and the corner of his mouth moved in the crooked, quickly gone, almost smile that she had spent 8 months learning to draw out of him. Afterward, they ate outside the Hargroves, and Thomas and Morris, and Cole and Nora, and the mountain families who had come down from the upper valley in the afternoon was warm, and the food was plain, and the conversation was easy, and above them, the pines moved in the highlight wind, and the mountains stood, and the valley held them all. Later, when everyone had gone and Thomas had ridden back to the Hargroves, and the valley was quiet again, Nora and Cole walked back toward the cabin together the long way around following the creek. She stopped at the point where the creek turned north and the valley opened up, where you could see both the cabin and the ridge above it and all the sky between. She had stood in this place many times now in snow and mud, in the first tender green of spring, and each time it had given her the same thing, the clear and steady sense of a place that would still be here when she was not, a place that had nothing to prove and no use for fear. Don't you dare leave me, she said, not dramatically, not with the weight of threat, simply the way you say a thing you mean and want the other person to have. Cole stopped beside her and looked at the valley and the ridge and the sky. "This is where I belong," he said. He looked at her. "With you." She leaned into him. He put his arm around her with the steady certainty of a man who does not make gestures he does not mean. And they stood in the valley in the late spring light, the mountains above them, and the creek beside them, and the whole long sky overhead. The valley was very still. Everything they had built from broken pieces was here with them in the ordinary light of an ordinary afternoon, solid and real in theirs. They walked back toward home. If Nora's story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you're new here, subscribe and ring that bell, because every week we bring you stories about ordinary people finding extraordinary courage. We'll see you in the next one.